The clatter of a fork against a porcelain plate echoed like a gunshot in the cavernous, empty dining room of Verona's crest. It was 2 in the morning, and my shift had officially ended an hour ago, but the men in the corner booth didn't care. They were shadows in expensive suits, their quiet conversation a low rumble that vibrated through the polished floorboards and up my aching spine. I was just Alara, the ghost who refilled their water glasses and cleared their plates, my movements practiced and invisible. For 2 years, since my father's accident, this had been my life, an endless cycle of exhaustion and grief, each tip a tiny chip against the mountain of debt he'd left behind. My reflection in the dark window showed a pale, tired woman, a stranger wearing my face. But tonight felt different. The air was thick with a silent, simmering tension, and the man at the head of the table, the one they all deferred to, hadn't taken his eyes off the door. I felt a primal knot of fear tighten in my stomach. It was the same suffocating dread I'd felt the day I learned my father was gone, a feeling that the world was about to tilt on its axis, and I was standing right on the fault line. It's a strange thing, that feeling of being on the edge of a cliff in your own life, knowing that one wrong step could send you plummeting. You might know what I'm talking about, that sensation when the ground beneath you feels unsteady, and you're just trying to hold on. If you've ever felt that kind of quiet desperation, or if you're just captivated by the storm brewing in this restaurant, I'd be so grateful if you took a moment to support this story. A simple like on the video or a comment letting me know you're here makes a huge difference. And if you subscribe to the channel, you'll be able to follow my journey to see if I ever find solid ground again. Your support is what allows these stories to be told, to reach people who might be feeling just as lost as I was in that moment. It means the world to know I'm not just speaking into the void, that someone out there is listening and understands. Now, let me take you back to that corner table, where my world was about to break wide open, all because of something I was never supposed to see. The man at the center of the storm was Alessandro Moretti. I didn't know his name then, of course. To me, he was just Mr. Moretti, the owner, a figure who materialized a few times a month like a specter of immense, silent power. He never smiled. His face was a mask of cold control, carved from Italian marble, with eyes so dark they seemed to absorb the dim, expensive light of the restaurant. He wore a suit that probably cost more than my apartment building, tailored so perfectly it looked like a second skin. While his men ate and drank, he only nursed a small glass of amber liquid, his movements economical and precise. He radiated an aura of stillness that was more intimidating than any overt threat. It was the stillness of a predator, perfectly confident in his place at the top of the food chain. He never looked directly at me, yet I felt his presence as a physical weight, a constant, low-grade danger that made the fine hairs on my arms stand on end. He was the embodiment of a world I was never meant to touch, a world of shadows and secrets that I instinctively knew had swallowed my father whole. My hands were trembling slightly as I reached for his empty glass. It was my last task before I could finally escape into the cold night air. Keep your head down, Alara. Don't make eye contact. Just do your job. The mantra had been my shield for 2 years. But as my fingers brushed past his hand, my gaze snagged on his wrist. Time didn't just slow down. It shattered. There, against the crisp white cuff of his shirt, was a watch. It wasn't just any watch. It was a 1968 Accutron Spaceview, its iconic open-face design revealing the intricate humming mechanism within. But it was the clasp that stole the air from my lungs. A small, custom-engraved phoenix, its wings spread wide, a tiny, unique detail my father had commissioned for his 30th birthday. I could feel the blood drain from my face, the heavy silence of the room pressing in on me. The sound of my own heartbeat became a deafening drum in my ears. It was impossible. That watch had been buried with him, or so I had been told. The world narrowed to that single gleaming object on a killer's wrist. The water glass slipped from my numb fingers, shattering on the marble floor. The sound was an explosion in the hushed opulence of the room. Every head in the booth snapped towards me. One of Mr. Moretti's men, a bull of a man with a scarred eyebrow, started to rise from his seat, his hand moving inside his jacket. But I didn't see him. I only saw the watch, my father's watch. The grief and rage I had suppressed for 2 long years erupted like a volcano, burning away my fear. I took a step forward, my voice a ragged whisper that cut through the silence like a knife. "Where did you get that?" I asked, my fingers shaking as I pointed. Mr. Moretti didn't answer. He simply raised his eyebrows, a flicker of cold annoyance in his dark eyes. I found a strength I didn't know I possessed, my voice growing louder, clearer. "That watch," I said, my words echoing in the sudden, absolute stillness. "My father wore that watch." The moment the words left my lips, his mask of indifference didn't just crack, it disintegrated. His face went completely pale, his jaw tightening as he stared at me, truly seeing me for the first time. It wasn't a look of anger or confusion. It was a look of pure, unadulterated shock. He and his men were gone moments later, leaving behind a wad of cash on the table that could have paid my rent for a year, and a silence that felt heavier than their presence. My manager, a man whose spine was made of jelly, fired me on the spot, his face slick with sweat as he stammered about disturbing our most valued clientele. I was cast out into the rainy pre-dawn streets with a final paycheck and a box containing my few personal belongings. The grief was a physical weight, but now it was laced with a terrifying new confusion. How did that man have my father's watch? As I walked under the flickering streetlights, the familiar sorrow was replaced by a sharp, prickling sense of being watched. A dark sedan with heavily tinted windows was crawling along the opposite side of the street, its engine a low, predatory growl. It kept pace with me, a shadow clinging to my heels. My heart hammered against my ribs. This wasn't random. This was connected. I ducked into a darker alley, hoping to lose them, but the move only cornered me, trapping me between a brick wall and the encroaching fear. Just as the sedan's doors began to open, a different set of headlights sliced through the darkness, pinning the car in a blinding glare. A long, black armored vehicle, the kind that belongs to presidents and warlords, materialized out of the rain and screeched to a halt, blocking the alley's entrance. The stalking car's engine roared, and it peeled away into the night, tires squealing in retreat. I was left trembling, my back pressed against the cold, wet brick. The rear window of the armored car glided down with a silent hum. Inside, shrouded in the dim interior light, was Alessandro Moretti. His face was a grim, unreadable mask, but his eyes were fixed on me with an intensity that rooted me to the spot. The cold arrogance was gone, replaced by something heavier, something that looked almost like regret. He didn't offer an explanation. He didn't apologize for costing me my job. His voice was low and rough, a command that was somehow also a lifeline. "Get in the car, Ilara," he said. He knew my name. In that moment, with my life in pieces and unknown predators circling, the most dangerous man I had ever met felt like the only safe harbor in the world. The silence in the armored car was a living thing, thick and suffocating, pressing in on me from all sides. I sat rigid on the plush leather seat, my hands clenched in my lap, trying to stop their trembling. Alessandro Moretti sat opposite me, a statue carved from shadow and steel, his face impassive as we glided through the rain-slick streets. He didn't offer explanations or apologies. He simply watched me, his dark eyes holding an unnerving intensity that made me feel stripped bare, every fear and vulnerability exposed. The journey was short, ending in front of the familiar, crumbling facade of my apartment building. He didn't get out. A different man, built like a mountain, opened my door. "Pack a bag," Alessandro's voice commanded from the car's interior, the words low and final. "You can't stay here." Defiance, foolish and desperate, surged through me. "You can't just order me around," I shot back, my voice thin and reedy. "This is my home." He didn't argue. A flicker of something that might have been patience, or perhaps weariness, crossed his features. "I'll be back," he said, and the car pulled away, its engine a deep, ominous purr that echoed the dread thrumming in my veins, leaving me alone on the wet pavement with a choice that felt like no choice at all. The next 24 hours were a masterclass in how quickly a life can unravel. My defiance crumbled into dust with the morning light. Taped to my door was an eviction notice, its bold red letters screaming my failure to the entire building. The notice period was impossibly short, clearly expedited by someone with influence. My landlord, a kind elderly man who used to bring me leftover pastries, couldn't meet my eye, mumbling about new ownership and pressures from above. My bank account, already perilously low, was a wasteland. I spent the day pounding the pavement, walking into every restaurant and cafe I could find, only to be met with polite but firm rejections. Word had spread, it seemed. A quiet, efficient blacklisting. The waitress who disturbed Mr. Moretti. By evening, the city that had once felt like a sprawling, anonymous comfort had transformed into a hostile labyrinth, every path a dead end. The crushing weight of my father's debt, a number I recited in my sleep, was no longer just a financial burden. It was a physical entity, a monster breathing down my neck, and I was utterly, terrifyingly alone in its path, invisible to everyone but the predators. The predators found me soon enough. His name was Sal, a bottom-feeder loan shark my father had made the mistake of borrowing from in a moment of desperation. He started with phone calls, his voice a greasy slick of false concern that quickly curdled into threats. Then he escalated. As I was walking home, defeated and empty-handed, he cornered me in the narrow alley beside the local market. He smelled of stale beer and desperation, a grotesque parody of power. "Heard you lost your job, sweet thing," he rasped, grabbing my arm.
His grip was surprisingly strong, his thumb pressing into a nerve, sending a jolt of pain up to my shoulder. His eyes, small and piggy, roamed over me with a possessive leer. "Maybe we can work out a new payment plan, something more personal." The humiliation was a hot, acid wave in my throat. This was the kind of scum my father had spent his life trying to protect people from. I found a burst of adrenaline-fueled strength, shoving him back against the grimy brick wall and running, his vile laughter echoing behind me, a chilling promise that this was only the beginning of my descent. I didn't see Alessandro until I was fumbling with the keys to my apartment, my hands shaking so badly I could barely fit the key in the lock. He was just there, leaning against the opposite wall of the dimly lit hallway, a silent sentinel in the gloom. With him was an older, silver-haired man whose kind eyes seemed to hold a world of sorrow. Alessandro's gaze wasn't cold this time. It was sharp, analytical, missing nothing. It swept over my rain-soaked coat, my pale face, and settled on the red, angry fingerprints blooming on my arm where Sal had grabbed me. A muscle in his jaw twitched, the only sign of the storm brewing beneath his controlled surface. He didn't need to ask what had happened. He already knew. "That was Sal," he stated, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that vibrated through the floor. "He works for Riccardo Costello now. Costello's family bought up your father's outstanding markers last week." The pieces of the puzzle slammed into place with sickening clarity. This wasn't a random series of misfortunes. It was a calculated, deliberate attack. I hadn't just fallen. I had been pushed, and the net was closing in. He never raised his voice, but the quiet, controlled fury radiating from him was more terrifying than any scream. It was the calm at the center of a hurricane. Standing in that dingy, flickering hallway, he laid out the truth with brutal precision. Riccardo Costello, the head of a rival organization, was the man who had orchestrated my father's workplace accident. The murder wasn't personal. It was a message, a demonstration of power. And now, I was a loose end, a potential liability, or worse, a pawn to be used against him. "Men like Costello," Alessandro said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper, laced with a contempt so pure it was almost tangible, "believe the world belongs to them. They use debt as a weapon to break people, to own them. They prey on the vulnerable because they are cowards." In that moment, his rigid moral code was laid bare. This wasn't about business or territory. It was about a fundamental violation of his principles. "Your father," he continued, his eyes meeting mine with a heavy, significant weight, "saved my life from men exactly like that. He understood what honor meant. His silent outrage wasn't just for me. It was for my father, a debt of honor being desecrated by Costello's actions. The offer, when it came, was not a negotiation. It was a declaration. He spoke with the absolute certainty of a man who reshapes the world to his will. He would assume all of it, every predatory loan, every cent of manufactured debt, the mortgage on the building itself. The eviction notice would vanish. Sal would never bother me again. My slate would be wiped clean. In return, I would come with him. He would give me a place to live, a fortress of glass and steel where Costello's reach could not extend. And I would work for him. He mentioned a charitable foundation he funded, an organization that provided legal aid and shelter for families crushed by the system. "It's a real job, Alara," he said, anticipating my protest. "But it will keep you close. It will keep you safe." The words hung in the air between us, a lifeline braided from gold and chains. It was salvation offered by the devil himself, a deal that would solve every material problem I had while shackling me to the very world that had widowed my mother and orphaned me. My pride, the last tattered remnant of my old life, screamed in silent, furious rebellion. "I don't want your help," I spat, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. My voice was trembling, but I forced myself to stand taller, to meet his unyielding gaze. "I don't want anything from you. My father, he would have hated this. He was a good man. He wasn't a criminal. I was trying to hurt him, to draw a line in the sand between his dark world and the memory of my father's light. I needed him to see that we were different, that I couldn't be bought, even with my own safety. Alessandro's expression didn't change, but something flickered in the depths of his eyes. Not anger, but a profound, weary sadness. It was the older man, Leo, who spoke, his voice gentle but firm, cutting through my desperate defiance. "Your father was a man of honor, Alara," he said softly. "And to a man of honor, a debt is sacred. But more sacred than any debt is the safety of his family. He would not want his pride to be the reason you were left to the wolves." His words were a dagger to my heart, twisting the very principles I was trying to uphold. Was I honoring my father by letting his enemies destroy me? The storm inside my head was deafening. The universe, it seemed, had grown tired of my indecision. As we stood locked in that tense emotional stalemate, the stairwell door creaked open. 2 figures emerged from the shadows at the end of the hall.
It was Sal and another man, bigger and uglier, both of them moving with a swaggering confidence that turned my blood to ice. They hadn't seen Alessandro or Leo, who were pressed into the alcove of my doorway. Sal's greasy smile widened when he saw me. "Look what we have here," he sneered, pulling a small, wicked-looking knife from his pocket. The cheap metal glinted under the single, buzzing light bulb. "Your time's up, sweetheart. Mr. Costello is tired of waiting." I opened my mouth to scream, but the sound was strangled by pure terror. In that split second, Alessandro moved. He wasn't a man anymore. He was a force of nature, a blur of dark, tailored wool and kinetic violence. It was over before it began. A sickening crack of bone, a choked gasp. He disarmed Sal and broke his wrist in one fluid motion, then disabled the other man with a single, precise strike to the throat. They crumpled to the floor, whimpering. Alessandro turned back to me, his breathing even, his suit immaculate. "Now do you see?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "This is not a negotiation." My knees gave out. I would have collapsed if not for the wall at my back. The fight, the pride, the desperate need to be anything other than a victim, it all evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, chilling clarity. He was right. There was no choice. There was only his world or Costello's, and Costello's world had a knife with my name on it. I could only manage a single jerky nod of surrender. The impossible deal was struck, not with a signature, but with the sounds of 2 men groaning on a dirty linoleum floor. Alessandro didn't gloat or say, "I told you so." He simply nodded once, a silent acknowledgement of my submission. "Leo will wait with you," he said. "Get what you need, nothing more." I stumbled back into my apartment, the small space that had been my cocoon of grief for 2 years. It now felt like a stranger's home, flimsy and unsafe. I moved on autopilot, grabbing a small duffel bag, stuffing it with a few changes of clothes, a worn paperback, and the framed photograph of my father from my nightstand. Leaving everything else behind felt strangely easy. Walking out of that building and into the waiting armored car was like stepping off a cliff, a voluntary plunge into a deep, dark, and unknown ocean. The heavy car door swung shut, the sound a final, definitive end to my old life. The penthouse was less a home and more a statement of power, a fortress of glass and steel perched atop the city like an eagle's nest. Alessandro gave me a tour that was as sterile and minimalist as the decor. White marble floors flowed into floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking, godlike view of the sprawling metropolis below. It was beautiful in the way a perfectly crafted weapon is beautiful, cold, efficient, and utterly devoid of warmth. He laid down the rules with the clipped precision of a general briefing his troops. I was not to leave without Leo or an approved guard. I was not to open the door for anyone. My phone was to be replaced with a secure one he provided. Every word was a bar in the gilded cage he was building around me. I felt a suffocating sense of vertigo, not from the height, but from the sudden, total loss of my own life. I was a fragile artifact he had acquired, a piece of his past that he was now placing on a very high, very secure shelf for safekeeping. My throat was tight with unspoken rebellion, but I simply nodded, the silence of the vast, empty space swallowing my surrender whole. It was the price of safety, a currency I was only just beginning to understand. The first few days passed in a surreal haze of structured silence. My new job was at a charitable foundation he funded, a sleek, anonymous office building downtown where I worked under Leo's watchful eye. The irony was a bitter pill to swallow. I was helping sort through the files of families destroyed by predatory lenders, the very same kind of vermin who had hounded my father, and then me. It was a glimpse into a different side of Alessandro's empire, one that used its immense resources to correct the injustices the system ignored. But my world had shrunk to the space between the penthouse and that office, ferried back and forth by a silent driver in an armored sedan. Alessandro himself was an enigma, a ghost in his own home. I'd see him in the evenings, a dark figure in his study, nursing a glass of whiskey as he read, the city lights painting a lonely halo around him. The silence between us was a living entity, thick with unspoken questions and simmering resentment. I tried to assert some small measure of control, once refusing a plate of food a housekeeper has left for me, a pathetic act of defiance that he didn't even seem to notice. The cage was comfortable, but it was a cage nonetheless. One evening, I found him standing before the vast window in the living room, a solitary silhouette against the glittering tapestry of the city. The simmering frustration finally boiled over. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. He didn't turn, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I want you to stay alive, Alara," he replied, his voice a low, flat monotone that grated on my last nerve. The condescension in his tone, the implication of my helplessness, ignited my pride. "I'm not a child," I snapped. "I survived for 2 years on my own."
"I don't need you to lock me away like some porcelain doll." He finally turned then, and the cold mask was gone. In its place was a flicker of something raw and deeply wounded, a pain so profound it momentarily stole my breath. "Your father thought he could survive on his own too," he said, the words quiet but weighted with the force of a physical blow. The accusation hung in the air between us, silencing my anger and replacing it with a fresh wave of grief. He had seen this before. He had watched a good man fall, and he was terrified of watching it happen all over again, with me. The watch on his wrist seemed to burn with the memory. My resolve to keep him at a distance, to see him only as a captor, began to fray with the smallest of gestures. While sorting through a stack of legal documents at the foundation, I gave myself a deep, vicious paper cut. It was a stupid, mundane injury, but it bled with surprising determination. I wrapped it in a cheap paper towel, annoyed at my own clumsiness. That evening, back at the penthouse, Alessandro noticed the pathetic bandage immediately. He said nothing, simply raised an eyebrow and disappeared into another room. He returned a moment later with a proper first aid kit. I expected him to just hand it to me, but instead he gestured for my hand. I hesitated, then reluctantly extended it. His fingers, which I knew were capable of such swift, brutal violence, were impossibly gentle as he unwrapped the soggy paper towel, cleaned the cut with an antiseptic wipe, and carefully applied a new bandage. He performed the simple task with a focused, silent intensity. The unexpected intimacy of his touch, the quiet, unasked-for care, sent a jolt through me. It was a silent admission that he saw me not as a symbol of his debt, but as a person, a woman with fragile skin who could be hurt by something as simple as a piece of paper. Just as I was beginning to adapt to the strange, tense rhythm of my new life, a force of nature swept into the penthouse in a cloud of expensive perfume and unapologetic authority. Sophia Moretti, Alessandro's mother, arrived without warning, her presence immediately filling the sterile space with a vibrant, formidable energy. She was a vision of old-world Italian elegance, her silver hair styled perfectly, her eyes as sharp and intelligent as her son's. I braced myself for the cold dismissal I expected from the matriarch of a crime family, but she surprised me. She gave me a long, appraising look, a slow scan from head to toe, and then a wry, knowing smile touched her lips. "So," she said, her voice a melodic command, "you are the girl who reminded my son that he is a man, not a machine." Over the next few hours, she didn't treat me like a problem to be managed or a debt to be sheltered. She treated me like a person. She asked about my father, not with pity, but with genuine respect. She shared stories of a younger, less guarded Alessandro, humanizing the cold, dangerous man who controlled my life. Her unexpected warmth and acceptance felt like a lifeline, a quiet endorsement that shifted the very foundations of my gilded cage. The fragile sense of normalcy that Sophia's visit had created was shattered a few days later. A package arrived for me at the foundation, a small, elegantly wrapped gift box that somehow bypassed the stringent security protocols Leo had in place. He brought it to the penthouse himself, his expression grim. My hands trembled as I opened it. There was no card, no note. Nestled on a bed of black tissue paper was a small, taxidermied barn. Its feathers were meticulously arranged, but its wings, spread wide in a mockery of flight, were blackened and charred at the tips. A phoenix rising from ashes that had consumed it. The message was a chilling, personal violation, a grotesque twisting of the symbol that connected Alessandro to my father. The blood rushed from my head, and the room tilted violently. Leo saw my face and was on his secure phone in an instant. Alessandro arrived minutes later, moving with a controlled urgency that was terrifying to behold. He didn't even glance at the box. His dark eyes were fixed on me, on the terror he saw reflected there. Costello hadn't just sent a threat, he had sent a declaration. He knew their shared secret, and he was telling me that no fortress, no matter how high, was truly safe. The aftermath of the dead bird was swift and suffocating. Any illusion of freedom I might have harbored was stripped away. I was no longer permitted to leave the penthouse, not even for the foundation. The panoramic windows that once felt like a connection to the world now seemed like a sniper's dream, a constant gaping vulnerability. Leo brought stacks of files for me to work on from the dining room table, turning my gilded cage into a solitary confinement cell. The number of guards doubled, their dark suits and silent vigilance a constant reminder of the invisible war being waged around me. The oppressive atmosphere frayed my nerves raw, and the tension between Alessandro and me stretched to a breaking point. One night I couldn't take it anymore and lashed out, my voice shaking with a mixture of fear and fury. "Is this your idea of protection? Locking me up like a prisoner? Using me as bait?" His face was stone, his voice devoid of all emotion. "This," he said, the words cutting through the air like chips of ice, "is what survival looks like. The package should never have reached you."
There's a traitor in my organization. The danger isn't just outside anymore, Alara. It's already inside the walls. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford, my nights haunted by shadows and the image of those charred wings. One night, wandering the silent penthouse, I found Alessandro in his study, the glow of his desk lamp illuminating a collection of old, faded photographs. He didn't try to hide them when he saw me standing in the doorway. He simply gestured for me to come closer. One photo showed a much younger him, maybe early 20s, with a cocky grin and an arm slung around another young man. "Before," he said, his voice a low rumble of memory and loss. Then his gaze fell to his wrist, to the watch my father had worn. "He gave me this after he pulled me from a burning warehouse. Costello's men left me to die. The admission was stark, stripped of all bravado. Your father told me the phoenix was a symbol of a second chance, a reminder that we can rise from the ashes of our own mistakes. It was our secret." His eyes, dark and filled with a pain that seemed bottomless, met mine. "Costello using it against you, it's a desecration. He's not just threatening you, he's trying to poison the memory of the only truly honorable man I ever knew. The debt wasn't a transaction, it was a sacred, living thing." A few days later, Sophia decided I was suffering from a severe case of cabin fever. "A bird kept in a cage forgets how to sing," she declared, insisting she take me for a drive. Alessandro protested, his jaw tight with anxiety, but his mother's will was a formidable force. He finally relented, on the condition that they take his most secure vehicle with a full security team and a follow car. The afternoon was deceptively peaceful as we drove through a quiet, wealthy suburban park, the trees forming a canopy of green above us. Then the world fractured. A city maintenance truck suddenly swerved, blocking the road ahead. Simultaneously, a heavy SUV slammed into our rear bumper, the impact jolting us forward. We were boxed in, a classic, perfectly executed ambush. Masked men poured out of both vehicles, armed with sledgehammers and crowbars. The quiet park erupted into a cacophony of shouting, screeching metal, and the sickening thud of hammers against armored glass. Sophia was preternaturally calm, but I was paralyzed by a primal terror. One of the attackers reached our car, his face a mask of brutal determination. He brought a hammer down on the driver's side window, again and again, until it finally spiderwebbed and shattered. He reached in, his eyes locking on mine, and I knew with chilling certainty this wasn't just a threat. This was an attempt to claim me. The world dissolved into a chaotic symphony of shattering glass and brutal percussive impacts. Shards of the reinforced window sprayed across the interior like deadly diamonds, and I screamed, a raw animal sound of pure terror. Sophia grabbed my arm, her grip surprisingly strong, her voice a sharp, steady command in the chaos. "Down, Alara, get down now." But it was Alessandro who moved like a phantom. In a single, fluid motion, he was over me, shoving me down onto the plush leather seat and covering my body with his own. His weight was a solid, grounding presence, a human shield against the violence erupting around us. I could hear the muffled shouts of the attackers, the sickening thud of metal against metal, and then the distinct, sharp cracks of gunfire from our follow car. The air grew thick with the smell of cordite and his cologne, a strange and terrifying combination. My face was pressed into the expensive wool of his suit jacket, my world reduced to darkness, the frantic beat of my own heart, and the steady, unyielding wall of the man who had become my unwilling protector. The car lurched violently, and I felt a new surge of motion as our driver found his moment. The armored vehicle became a battering ram, shoving the maintenance truck aside with a deafening screech of tortured metal. We accelerated with a force that pinned me even harder against the seat, the world outside a terrifying, incomprehensible blur of motion and violence. Alessandro didn't move a muscle. His body remained a rigid, protective shield over mine until we were blocks away, weaving through traffic at a speed that felt reckless and desperate. Only when the wail of distant sirens faded behind us did he finally shift his weight, allowing me to sit up. The silence that descended inside the car was heavier and more suffocating than the chaos of the attack. Sophia was the first to break it, her voice astonishingly calm as she adjusted her silk scarf. "Well," she murmured, dabbing at a small cut on her cheek with a handkerchief, "that was certainly more excitement than I anticipated." I looked at Alessandro. His face was a mask of cold, controlled fury, his jaw set so tightly a muscle jumped beneath the skin. He said nothing, but his dark eyes swept over me, a quick analytical scan for any injury, his intensity a silent promise of the brutal retribution that would surely follow. Back in the sterile silence of the penthouse, the adrenaline finally gave way to a deep, bone-rattling tremor I couldn't control. Alessandro was a storm contained within a suit, pacing the length of the living room as he spoke into his secure phone, his voice a low, lethal current of commands that promised a swift and merciless reckoning for those who had failed him.
Sophia guided me to a sofa, pressing a glass of water into my trembling hands. "He is not angry with you, child," she said softly, her sharp eyes full of a surprising empathy. "He is furious with himself. In his world, a failure of protection is the greatest sin." I watched him, this man of immense, terrifying power, and for the first time I saw the crushing weight of it. He hung up the phone, and for a fraction of a second, his shoulders slumped, a momentary crack in the marble facade before he straightened again. He turned to face me, the self-recrimination in his eyes so profound it was like looking into a black abyss. "This should not have happened," he bit out, the words laced with a fury directed entirely inward. "My home, my car. They should have been impenetrable. They reached you. That is a failure I will not tolerate again." Later that night, long after Sophia had retired to a guest suite, I found him in his study. He wasn't working. He was simply standing in the dark, staring at the Accutron watch, which he had taken off and placed on the polished surface of his desk. "He never wanted this life for me," Alessandro said without turning, his voice a low rumble of memory and regret that seemed to be pulled from the deepest part of his soul. "Your father, he saw the poison in it, the way it corrupts everything it touches. The night he saved me, he told me to get out, to build something clean, something that lasts." He finally picked up the watch, its delicate mechanism gleaming in the moonlight. He said this was a reminder that time is a gift we are given to build, not a weapon to destroy. I promised him I would try. A heavy silence filled the room before he spoke again. "The man who led the ambush today, I knew him. He was one of my father's most trusted men, someone I was supposed to be able to trust." He finally turned to me, his guard completely down, his eyes filled with a raw, ancient pain. "I failed your father then by staying in this life. I will not fail him now by letting it take you." As he spoke, the moonlight caught a dark stain spreading across the crisp white cuff of his shirt, a deep gash from a shard of glass, an injury he hadn't even seemed to notice, so consumed was he by his own guilt and rage. "You're bleeding," I said, my voice barely a whisper, the simple observation cutting through the weight of his confession. He glanced down at his arm as if seeing it for the first time, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. Without a word, I went to the bathroom and returned with the same first aid kit he had once used on me. The silent reversal of our roles hung in the air, a powerful, unspoken shift in our dynamic. He sat down in his leather chair, a rare moment of acquiescence, and allowed me to gently unbutton his cuff and tend to the wound. His skin was warm beneath my tentative fingers. As I carefully cleaned the cut, our proximity became an electric field. I could feel the heat radiating from him, see the steady, strong pulse in his throat, and smell the faint, lingering scent of gunpowder on his suit. For that one suspended moment, we were not a mafia boss and his charge. We were just a man and a woman, bound together by violence and this quiet, intimate act of care. The fragile moment was shattered by the soft chime of the private elevator announcing an arrival. Leo stepped into the study, his expression a mixture of grim satisfaction and exhaustion. He took in the scene, me tending to Alessandro's arm, the charged stillness between us, without a flicker of surprise, his focus entirely on the mission. "We have him," Leo said, his voice low and final. "Antonio, the driver of the follow car. He fed Costello our route. Costello paid off his gambling debts." Alessandro's face instantly hardened, the brief window of vulnerability slamming shut as the cold, decisive leader reemerged. "Where is he?" Alessandro asked, his voice devoid of all warmth. "He is being persuaded to share everything he knows," Leo replied, the euphemism landing with chilling finality. He held out a tablet. "This is the more immediate problem. Costello didn't just want to abduct you, Alara. His men were equipped to broadcast it live on a private network. He wanted to show everyone that Moretti's protection is a myth, that he can reach out and touch anyone Alessandro cares about. The calculated cruelty of it stole the air from my lungs. I wasn't just a target. I was a message, a living symbol Costello intended to use to bring Alessandro's entire empire crashing down." Alessandro stared at the dark screen of the tablet for what felt like an eternity, the muscles in his jaw working silently. The strategist, the general, the king of this dark, violent chessboard, was back in absolute control, weighing his losses and planning his countermove. When he finally looked up, his voice was flat, stripped of all emotion, a man making a decision that would change everything. "She can no longer stay here. The penthouse has been compromised. It's a known location, a fixed target." His gaze shifted to me, intense and unyielding, seeing not just me but all the angles of the game I was now the center of. "My family has an estate in the mountains north of the city. It's been in the Moretti name for 100 years. It is a fortress, isolated, fortified, completely self-sufficient. Leo's people have been preparing it for the last week, on my orders, as a contingency." This wasn't a question or a suggestion.
It was the declaration of a new reality. "Costello's strategy is to attack my heart," he said, his eyes locking with mine in a stark, breathtaking admission of what I had become to him. "So I will remove my heart from his reach. We leave at dawn." The words "attack my heart" hung in the air, a confession that was more intimate than any touch, more binding than any promise. They stripped away the final remnants of my denial, incinerating the carefully constructed walls I had built around myself. I was no longer a debt he was repaying, or a ghost from his past he was obligated to protect. I was his vulnerability, the one weak point in his impenetrable armor, and our enemy knew it. My old life, the grieving waitress desperately trying to remain invisible, felt like a distant memory, a story about a different person. That woman would have fought this, would have screamed about being a prisoner, about her rights, her freedom. But I had seen the brutal determination in the attacker's eyes. I had felt the solid, living shield of Alessandro's body over mine. I finally understood the terrifying, binary nature of this world: his protection or Costello's possession. I looked from Leo's exhausted but loyal face to Alessandro's, now a mask of grim, unwavering resolve. My safety was now inextricably woven with his power, his control, his very survival. To refuse this move would be to hand Costello the very weapon he needed to destroy him. "Okay," I said, the single word an oath, a surrender not to him, but to our shared reality. It was an acceptance of my place in this war. The drive to the mountain estate was a silent ascent into another world, leaving the wounded, bleeding city behind us. The fortress, as Alessandro had called it, was less a building and more a part of the mountain itself, a sprawling structure of dark stone and reinforced glass that seemed to grow organically from the granite cliffs. It was surrounded by a dense forest of ancient pines, their scent clean and sharp in the cold air. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I could breathe. The immediate, suffocating threat had been left miles below, and in its place was a profound, unnerving quiet.
We spent the first 48 hours in a state of suspended animation, a fragile truce with reality. Alessandro was a coiled spring of tension, but he was present, his watchful gaze a constant grounding force. We ate silent meals on a terrace overlooking a valley cloaked in mist, the only sounds the cry of a distant hawk and the whisper of the wind. In those quiet moments, watching the way the setting sun caught the silver in his hair, a dangerous, foolish hope began to bloom in my chest. A hope that this gilded cage could somehow, someday, feel like a home. A hope that was about to be utterly and brutally incinerated. The illusion of safety shattered with the piercing ring of a satellite phone. Leo answered it, his face draining of all color as he listened, his expression crumbling from professional calm into one of profound, personal horror. He didn't have to say the words. The devastation in his eyes was a language I now understood all too well. "It's Sophia," he finally managed, his voice a ragged whisper that seemed to be physically ripped from his throat. "Costello has her." The news landed in the cavernous great room not as a sound, but as a physical force, a shockwave that buckled the very air around us. Alessandro, who had been staring out at the serene mountain landscape, went unnaturally still. He didn't turn. He didn't speak. For a long, terrifying moment, he was a statue of pure, condensed rage. The fortress, my symbol of sanctuary, instantly transformed. It was no longer a refuge. It was a prison of our own making, a remote outpost where we were cut off and isolated while the true heart of his family was being ripped out. Costello hadn't attacked the walls. He had bypassed them entirely, striking at the one person Alessandro believed to be untouchable. The quiet mountain air now felt thin and suffocating, thick with the silence of a king who had just had his queen stolen from the board. The traitor was a man named Marco, a distant cousin and a fixture in the Moretti family since childhood, a man whose loyalty had been as unquestioned as the sunrise. Alessandro's retribution was swift and unseen, a dark current of violence that flowed down the mountain through encrypted channels and loyal men. But the information Marco gave up before his silence became permanent was a poison that targeted me directly. He confessed that Costello's hatred wasn't just business, it was ancient and deeply personal. My father, Marcus Vance, hadn't just been an honorable security chief who saved a young man's life out of the goodness of his heart. Years before that, he had been one of Costello's most trusted lieutenants. Saving Alessandro wasn't just an act of mercy, it was the final act of his betrayal against Costello, the moment he chose a side and broke with his past. The watch, the phoenix, our supposed symbol of honor and second chances, was also a symbol of that treason. My father wasn't an innocent bystander caught in the crossfire. He was a soldier who had deserted, and I was the living, breathing legacy of his defection, a constant reminder of Costello's humiliation. The entire foundation of my story, of my grief, was built on a lie.
The weight of that revelation was a physical thing, a crushing pressure that threatened to pulverize my bones into dust. I was no longer the daughter of a hero. I was the daughter of a traitor, a ghost from a past war that had never truly ended. Every kindness Alessandro had shown me, every protective gesture, was now tainted by this new, ugly truth. He hadn't just been repaying a debt of honor, he had been cleaning up the messy consequences of my father's choices. And I was the mess. My presence in his life was the catalyst for all of this. I was the weakness Costello had so brilliantly and cruelly exploited. The dead bird, the ambush, and now Sophia, a kind, elegant woman who had shown me nothing but warmth, was in the hands of a monster because of me. I looked at Alessandro, who was now a specter of cold, controlled fury, his face carved into a mask of grief, and I couldn't breathe for the guilt. The blood on Costello's hands felt like it was on mine. I was a walking, talking vulnerability, a human liability, and my very existence was going to be the end of the only family he had left. The protection he offered wasn't a shield. It was a target I had painted on his back. His pain manifested as a wall of ice, a cold, brutal efficiency that had no room for me. He shut down completely,
his grief and rage channeled into a single, terrifying purpose. He and Leo spoke in low, clipped tones, mapping out strategies that I could only half understand, their words like shards of glass in the tense silence. He was going to meet Costello. He was going to offer an exchange, his life for his mother's. It was a fool's errand, a blatant trap, and he knew it. When I tried to protest, to plead with him to see that this was exactly what Costello wanted, he finally turned on me. The look in his eyes wasn't just anger, it was a profound, weary agony. "Your father's legacy has been a shadow over my entire life," he said, his voice a low, cutting rasp. "I will not let it be the reason my mother dies." The words were not an accusation, but they landed like a conviction. He saw me in that moment as the embodiment of a curse. He held up a hand, silencing any further argument. "Stay out of this, Alara," he commanded, his voice devoid of all warmth. "You've been enough of a complication." The door to his study closed with a quiet, definitive click, shutting me out and severing the fragile bond we had built, leaving me utterly alone with my crushing guilt. I couldn't let him die. Not for me. Not for a debt to a man who was more complicated than I ever knew. If I was the complication, then the solution was simple. I had to remove myself from the equation. While he and Leo were locked away, consumed by the logistics of his impending sacrifice, I moved through the silent fortress like a ghost. My plan was desperate, fueled by a toxic cocktail of guilt and a fierce, protective love I could no longer deny. I found a service exit in the kitchen pantry, a detail I'd noticed during my first restless night, a small vulnerability in the otherwise perfect security. I scribbled a note on a piece of stationery from his desk, my hand shaking so badly the words were nearly illegible. "A debt for a life. You saved mine. We are even. Go get your mother. Don't look for me." It was cold, transactional, the only language I thought he would understand. I left it on his pillow, next to the indentation where my head had rested just hours before. I took nothing. No money, no coat, just the clothes I was wearing. Slipping out into the cold, pre-dawn darkness of the mountains was the hardest thing I had ever done. Each step away from him a fresh tear in my soul. It wasn't an escape to freedom. It was a surrender to oblivion. The world outside the fortress walls was a vast, cold, and indifferent wilderness. The wind howled through the pines, a lonely, mournful sound that echoed the emptiness that had opened up inside me. I had no destination, no plan beyond putting as much distance as possible between myself and the man I was trying to save. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every rustle of leaves the sound of Costello's men. My desperate act of sacrifice now felt like a foolish, childish gesture against a tide of immense dark power. I was utterly alone, a pawn who had thrown herself from the board, believing it would stop the game. Back in the silent penthouse, Alessandro would find my note. I could picture it perfectly, his cold mask shattering, replaced not by relief, but by a new, more profound devastation. In his attempt to shield me, he had pushed me away, and in my attempt to save him, I had abandoned him at his lowest moment. Costello had won. He had successfully stripped Alessandro of his mother, his fortress, and now the very person he was fighting for. I stood shivering on the edge of a dark, empty mountain road, a ghost in the making, while he stood alone in his gilded cage, holding my final words, a king with nothing left to protect and everything left to lose. He found her note on the pillow where her head should have been, the scent of her still lingering on the cool cotton. Alessandra Moretti did not crumble. He did not rage. The agony of her absence, the brutal finality of her words, "We are even," was a thing he folded into a small, cold, lethally sharp point deep inside his chest. It became fuel.
He stood in the silent bedroom as the sun crested the mountains, the magnificent view a mockery of the desolation within him, and became a machine of pure, calculated retribution. He understood Costello's strategy perfectly, to isolate him, to strip him of his heart so he would make a mistake. Ilara's desperate, noble sacrifice had inadvertently completed Costello's work. In front of Leo, his face was an unreadable mask of granite. He issued a string of quiet, precise commands, mobilizing every asset, every informant, every shadow that owed him fealty. The hunt was no longer just for his mother. It was for the woman who had run into the wilderness to save him, and he would tear the world apart, stone by stone, until he brought her back from the cold. He would not fail his debt to Marcus Vance a second time. Ilara, meanwhile, refused to be a ghost. The cold mountain air was a harsh baptism, washing away the last of the terrified victim she had once been. Shivering in the back of a cargo truck she'd hitched a ride with, she was no longer running away from Alessandro, but running toward a solution. The revelation of her father's past was not just a source of shame, it was a potential map. She dredged her memory for every story, every casual remark, every fragment of the life he had tried to leave behind. A name surfaced, hazy at first, then sharp with clarity. Gus, a bookkeeper, a man my father had called the ghost who knows where all the bodies are buried, and a place, a greasy spoon diner called the Blue Phoenix, tucked away in an industrial wasteland on the city's forgotten fringe. It was a desperate, flimsy thread, but it was hers. It was a chance to find a weapon, a piece of leverage, something to trade for Sophia's life that didn't require Alessandro to walk into a slaughterhouse. She would not be the complication. She would be the key, using the very legacy of betrayal that had haunted her to finally end the war her father had started. The Blue Phoenix was exactly as desolate as she'd imagined, smelling of stale coffee and decades of cigarette smoke. But Gus was there, an old man with eyes that had seen too much, hiding in plain sight. When she said her father's name, his face, a roadmap of wrinkles, softened with a sad, profound recognition. He had been waiting for this day, for the daughter of the only friend he ever had. He led her to a dusty back room and revealed his life's work, a set of meticulously kept ledgers, the paper trail of Ricardo Costello's entire criminal enterprise. It was all there, extortion, bribery, and the details of a payoff for the murder of a federal prosecutor, a crime with no statute of limitations. As Gus explained the contents, Alessandro's own vast intelligence network was closing in from another direction. Leo's voice, grim and steady over the encrypted line, confirmed the location, a derelict shipping yard on the waterfront. Costello was holding Sophia there. Gus looked at Ilara, his expression grave. "He's meeting a senator there tonight," he whispered, "to deliver the final payment for his immunity." The two threads of their separate wars had just converged on a single, deadly point on the map. Costello was holding court in the cavernous, rusting shell of a warehouse, a king on a throne of decay. He savored the moment, the culmination of a lifelong vendetta. He had Sophia Moretti, a symbol of old-world power, and now he had Ilara Vance, the dose of his greatest humiliation. Her desperate attempt to trade the ledgers had been laughably predictable. His men had been waiting for her. He let Alessandro hear both of their voices over the phone, his own words a silken caress of pure poison. "A difficult choice, Alessandro," he purred. "Your past or your future, your mother or your heart. Come to the shipyard, alone. You have 1 hour to decide which one of them you're willing to live without." He clicked the phone off, leaving Alessandro in a silence more violent than any scream. Ilara met Sophia's gaze across the grimy space. The older woman's eyes were not filled with fear, but with a fierce, unyielding fire. In that shared look of defiance, Ilara understood. They were not pawns. They were the Moretti women, and they would not make it easy for the monster who thought he had already won. He walked into the warehouse as if walking to his own execution, his hands empty, his face a mask of defeat. Costello's laughter echoed off the high steel rafters, but Alessandro's eyes weren't on his enemy. They were on Ilara. He saw the terror there, but beneath it, he saw the fire she had found, the same unbending strength he had seen in her father. He spoke, his voice heavy with resignation, seemingly addressing Costello. "My mentor once told me that time is a gift we are given to build." He paused, his gaze locking with hers, infusing the next word with a universe of meaning. "But tonight, time is a gift we are given to act." It was enough. As Costello raised his weapon, savoring the final moment, Ilara screamed. It was not a scream of fear, but a battle cry of pure, unadulterated rage. She launched herself sideways, knocking over a stack of rusted oil drums with a deafening crash. The chaos lasted only a second, but it was all the time the phantoms in the darkness needed. Leo and his men descended, their movements silent and brutally efficient.
Alessandro himself dealt with Costello, not with a killing blow, but with a precise, disarming strike that shattered his wrist, leaving him a broken, whimpering mess for the federal agents who were already swarming the docks. The aftermath was a whirlwind of flashing lights and shouting men, but for Alessandro, the world had narrowed to a single point. He went to her, his long strides eating up the distance, his eyes scanning her for any injury, his hands reaching for her with a tremor he couldn't conceal. The cold, controlled mask of the dawn was gone, replaced by the raw, unguarded face of a man who had just pulled his entire world back from the edge of an abyss. "You fought," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. It was more than love. It was reverence. Weeks later, when the last of Castello's empire had been dismantled and Sofia was safe, he brought her to a sunlit terrace overlooking the ocean. He laid out the documents for her new life: a clean passport, a bank account with a fortune in it, a plane ticket to anywhere. "The debt is paid, Alara. You are free." She looked at the papers, then back at him, at the Accutron watch still on his wrist. She gently placed her hand over it. "My father gave you a second chance at life," she said softly, her choice absolute and clear. "My home is with you. Let's not waste it." The months that followed were a lesson in how a world can be rebuilt, not just from ashes, but from the solid ground of justice. Ricardo Castello's empire didn't just fall. It was systematically dismantled, its poisoned roots pulled from the city's soil by federal agents armed with Gus's meticulous ledgers. The news report spoke of a stunning victory against organized crime, a narrative of good versus evil that was far too simple for the truth I now knew. In our own world, the change was quieter but more profound. Alessandro purged the last vestiges of his father's brutal legacy, promoting men like Leo whose loyalty was to honor, not just power. The charitable foundation became my purpose, and I was no longer just sorting files. I sat in on board meetings, my voice heard and respected, as we expanded our reach, creating real havens for families caught in the same predatory traps that had nearly destroyed mine. The penthouse, once a beautiful prison, slowly transformed. Its vast empty spaces began to fill not with fear, but with the quiet, steady rhythm of a shared life, a future we were consciously, deliberately building together, piece by precious piece. The grand, terrifying gestures of protection were replaced by 1,000 small, intimate moments of peace. Our mornings began not with security briefings, but with coffee on the balcony, watching the city wake up below us, a world we were now a part of, not just observing from a fortress. He would listen, truly listen, as I talked about a new legal aid initiative or a family we had successfully relocated, his insights sharp and his support unwavering. One evening, I found him asleep in his study, the weight of his world finally too heavy, and I gently draped a blanket over his shoulders, my hand lingering on the strong line of his back. He was no longer the impenetrable Don, but a man who could be vulnerable with me. Sofia became a constant, welcome presence, teaching me old family recipes in the vast kitchen, her sharp wit a perfect foil to her son's quiet intensity. We were forging a new kind of family, not one bound by blood or obligation, but by the shared, unspoken understanding that we had all been given a second chance, and that this time we would build something that was meant to last, something beautiful and strong. 6 months after the night at the shipyard, Verona's crest reopened. The night was a quiet celebration, not of a victory in a war, but of a new beginning. The dim, intimidating lighting had been replaced with a warm, inviting glow. The corner booth where my nightmare had started was now occupied by a laughing, happy family. I stood beside Alessandro near the entrance, not in a waitress uniform, but in a simple, elegant dress, a partner at his side. He had offered the restaurant to me, a legitimate business to run as my own, a tangible piece of the clean world he had promised my father he would build. As I watched the bustling, joyful room, I saw that our story had come full circle, a testament to the idea that even the darkest places can be filled with light. Knowing that so many of you have been on this journey with me, watching this new life unfold, means more than I can say. Your support reminds me that stories of hope and second chances are what connect us all, and for that, I am eternally grateful. This new chapter, this quiet piece, is something I'll never take for granted. A few weeks later, we were at the mountain estate, which was no longer a fortress but a true sanctuary. The morning sun streamed into the warm, rustic kitchen, the air filled with pine and fresh coffee. Alessandro walked in, not in one of his immaculate suits, but in a soft, worn sweater that made him look younger, more approachable. He said nothing, simply came to stand behind me as I looked out at the valley, his hands resting gently on my shoulders. I felt the familiar weight of his presence, no longer a source of intimidation, but of profound comfort and safety.
He slowly unclasped the watch from his wrist, the 1968 Accutron Spaceview that had started everything.
He took my hand and carefully fastened the leather strap around my own wrist. The intricate mechanism hummed softly against my skin. He would have wanted his daughter to have it, he said, his voice a low, steady murmur against my hair. The watch, once a symbol of a violent past and a heavy, binding debt, was now a promise. It was the legacy of a good man, the symbol of a life saved, and the quiet, enduring heartbeat of a love that had risen from the ashes.